Have you ever wondered what life was like for the millions of slaves who built the Roman Empire? This soothing story will take you back in time to the hidden lives of these forgotten individuals, revealing their daily struggles and routines. Prepare to drift off to sleep as you learn about their world. The quills scratched against the papyrus, a sound as familiar to Livia as her own heartbeat. In the dim flicker of the oil lamp, she hunched over the senator's ledger, her fingers stained with ink, her eyes burning from hours of transcription. The household of Gaius Marcellus, a senator of middling influence, but boundless ambition, was quiet now, save for the distant clatter of pots in the kitchen and the occasional groan of a cart on the cobbled street beyond the villa's walls. It was past midnight, and Livia, a slave of 23 summers, was still awake, her task unending. She was no ordinary slave, not a cook, nor a cleaner, nor one of the field hands who toiled in the senator's distant estates. She was a scribe, a rarity among the enslaved, her mind honed by a Greek tutor in her childhood, before war had torn her from Athens and cast her into Rome's unyielding grasp. The ledger before her was a map of Marcellus's world, shipments of grain from Egypt, taxes collected from tenants in Campania, bribes paid to curry favor with the emperor's advisors. Each line was a thread in the senator's web, and Livia wove them together with precision. But tonight, her hand trembled, not from fatigue but from a secret that weighed heavier than the iron collar around her neck. Tucked beneath the ledger, hidden in a fold of her coarse tunic, was a scrap of papyrus no larger than her palm. On it, in her careful script, were words that could end her life, a tally of stolen grain, siphoned from Marcellus's stores and distributed to the starving slaves of a neighboring insula. It was a small act, a whisper of defiance, but to Livia, it was a spark in the darkness. She glanced at the door, her heart lurching at the faint creak of a floorboard. The villa was a labyrinth of eyes and ears, slaves who might betray her for a crust of bread, freedmen who served as Marcellus's spies. Even the walls seemed to listen, their frescoes of nymphs and gods staring down with cold indifference. Livia's breath caught as she slipped the scrap deeper into her tunic, her fingers brushing the rough fabric. She forced herself to focus, dipping the quill into the ink pot and resuming her work. The numbers swam before her eyes. Ducenta modia fermenti, 200 measures of grain, shipped from Alexandria. She wrote, her hand steady now, though her mind raced. Livia had been 7 when the Romans came to Athens. She remembered the smoke, the screams, the way her father's hand had slipped from hers as soldiers dragged him away. Her education, a gift from her scholar father, had saved her from the fields or the brothels. A Roman merchant, seeing her potential, had bought her and trained her as a scribe before selling her to Marcellus's household. She was valuable, a tool as prized as the senator's silver cups. But a tool could be discarded if it broke, and Livia was breaking, not in body but in spirit, her small acts of rebellion chipping away at the fear that had once kept her obedient. The lamp flickered, casting shadows across the room. The air smelled of olive oil and wax, mingled with the faint tang of the Tiber that drifted through the open window. Livia's cubiculum, a narrow cell off the atrium, was sparse, a straw pallet, a wooden stool, a shelf for her few possessions, a comb, a clay cup, a tattered scroll of Sappho's poetry, a relic of her past life. She had read those verses so often that the words lived in her mind, a quiet refuge from the clamor of servitude. But tonight, Even Sappho could not soothe her. The scrap of papyrus burned against her skin, a reminder of the risk she had taken. Footsteps approached, heavy and deliberate. Livia's heart pounded as she slid the ledger over the inkpot, hiding her work. The door swung open, revealing Drusus, the freedman who managed the household slaves. His face was a mask of suspicion, his eyes narrow beneath a shock of graying hair. "Still at it, Greek," he said, his voice low, almost mocking. Livia nodded, keeping her gaze on the ledger. "The master expects the accounts by dawn," she murmured, her tone deferential. Drusus lingered, his shadow falling across the desk. "You're too clever for your own good," he said, stepping closer. "Clever slaves don't last long." Livia's fingers tightened around the quill, but she kept her expression blank. "I only do my duty," she said softly. "Teh," Drusus snorted, his breath sour with wine. He reached for the ledger, flipping through the pages with careless fingers. Livia held her breath, praying he wouldn't notice the slight tremor in her handwriting, the faint smudge where her hand had faltered. "See that you do," he said at last, tossing the ledger back onto the desk. "The master's in a foul mood. Triton's new taxes are bleeding him dry." He turned to leave, then paused, glancing back. "And don't think I don't see you, scribbling in the dark. I know your kind, always plotting." The door closed behind him, and Livia exhaled, her hands shaking. Drusus was a threat, but not the only one. Marcellus himself was unpredictable, a man whose smiles hid cruelty. She had seen him flog a slave for spilling wine, had heard the screams of those sent to the mines for lesser offenses. Yet Livia could not stop. The stolen grain had fed a dozen mouths, had bought her a fleeting sense of power in a world that stripped her of it. She thought of the others involved, a cook named Zoe, a stable hand whose name she didn't know, a network of shadows moving through Rome's underbelly. They were her strength, her reason to keep going. She returned to the ledger, her quill moving swiftly now. The numbers were a code, a way to hide her truth in plain sight. To Marcellus, they were wealth. To Livia, they were a weapon. She worked until the lamp sputtered out, until the first light of dawn crept through the window, painting the walls with gold. The scrap of papyrus remained hidden, a secret she would carry into the day. As she rose, stretching her aching limbs, she whispered a line from Sappho. "Someone will remember us, I say, even in another time." For Livia, it was a vow. She would be remembered, not as a slave, but as a woman who dared to fight. The villa stirred to life around her, the sounds of mourning breaking the silence. Livia tucked the ledger under her arm and stepped into the atrium, her heart steady now. She was one of thousands, a speck in Rome's vast machine. But she was not invisible, not yet. The sand burned beneath Cassian's feet, coarse and unforgiving, as he swung the wooden rudies in a wide arc. The training yard of the Ludis Magnus, Rome's greatest gladiatorial school, was a cauldron of heat and sweat, the air thick with dust and the tang of blood. Around him, men grunted and cursed, their blades clashing in mock combat, while the lanista, a scar-faced Roman named Quintus, barked orders from the sidelines. Cassian, a Gaul of 26, towered over most of his fellow trainees, his broad shoulders and corded arms marked by scars from battles fought long before Rome had claimed him. His hair, once long and braided in the style of his people, was cropped short, a brand of his enslavement. Yet his eyes, a piercing green, held a fire that no whip could extinguish. He parried a blow from his sparring partner, a wiry Thracian named Milo, whose curved sika flashed in the midday sun. The wooden swords were blunt, but the force behind Milo's strike sent a jolt through Cassian's arm. Slow, Gull, Milo taunted, his grin sharp beneath a crooked nose. Cassian didn't reply. Words were a luxury he rationed, his focus honed on survival. He countered with a thrust, driving Milo back, his movements precise despite the weight of the iron manacles that chafed his wrists. The chains were light, meant for training, but they were a constant reminder. He was property, a beast to be tamed for the arena's bloodthirsty crowds. The Ludus Magnus sprawled on the edge of the Colosseum, its walls of tufa stone enclosing a world of violence and despair. Cassian had been here for 6 months, sold to the Lanista after a rebellion in Gaul had left his village in ashes. He had been a warrior once, a son of chieftains, leading men against the legion's advance. Now he was a mermail, a gladiator armed with a short sword and heavy shield, his life measured in fights won and wounds endured. Freedom was a distant promise, dangled by Quintus like a bone before a dog. Survive enough bouts, and he might earn a rudis. Come, the wooden sword of liberty. Come. Cassian clung to that hope, though he knew it was a lie for most. Again, Quintus roared, his whip cracking against the ground. Cassian reset his stance, sweat stinging his eyes. The training was relentless. Hours of drills, sparring, and running under the sun's merciless glare. His body ached, his left knee throbbing from an old injury. But pain was an old friend. He struck at Milo, their swords clashing in a rhythm that echoed the pulse of the yard. Beyond the walls, he heard the distant roar of the Colosseum, where a minor spectacle was underway. Soon, it would be his turn to face the arena, to kill or be killed for Rome's amusement. As the drill ended, Cassian lowered his sword, his chest heaving. Milo clapped his shoulder, a rare gesture of camaraderie. You fight like a demon, the Thracian said, wiping blood from a split lip. But demons die too. Cassian nodded, his gaze drifting to the other gladiators. Men from every corner of the empire, their skin marked by brands and tattoos, their eyes hollow with the weight of their fate. Some were volunteers, free men seeking glory. Most, like Cassian, were slaves, their lives bought and sold like cattle. He wondered how many would survive the next games. Trajan's gift to celebrate his Dacian victories. Quintus called a halt, and the men shuffled toward the water trough, their chains clinking. Cassian drank deeply, the lukewarm water tasting of clay. As he straightened, he caught sight of a figure at the yard's edge. A girl, no more than 16, carrying a basket of bread. She was a slave, her tunic patched, and her dark hair tied back with a strip of cloth. Her eyes met his for a fleeting moment, and Cassian felt a jolt, not of desire but of recognition. She was one of them, a shadow in Rome's vast machine, yet her gaze held a quiet strength. She handed bread to a guard, then slipped back through the gate, her steps silent on the stone, eyes off. Gaul. Quintus snapped, his whip coiled but ready. Cassian turned away, his jaw tight. The girl was a distraction, and distractions were dangerous. Yet her face lingered in his mind, a spark in the gray monotony of his days. He had seen her before, he realized, delivering supplies to the Ludus. She was no gladiator's woman, no camp follower seeking coin. She was something else, someone who moved with purpose. The afternoon wore on. The men herded into the barracks for a meal of barley porridge and sour wine. Cassian sat on a straw mat, his back against the cool stone wall, listening to the low hum of conversation. Milo spoke of rumors, a senator's banquet where gladiators would fight for sport, a chance for extra coin. Others whispered of escape, though such talk was folly. The ludus was a fortress, its gates barred, its guards armed. Cassian ate in silence, his thoughts drifting to the girl. He wondered what her life was, what chains she bore beyond the iron collar that marked her as property. Night fell, the barracks lit by a single lamp. Cassian lay on his mat, the straw prickling his skin. Sleep was elusive, his mind replaying the day's drills, the girl's fleeting glance. He thought of his village, of the forests where he'd hunted as a boy, of his sister's laughter before the Romans came. The memories were sharp, cutting deeper than any blade. He closed his eyes, forcing them away. To dwell on the past was to weaken, and he could not afford weakness. A sound broke his thoughts, a soft scrape at the barracks door. Cassian tensed, his hand reaching for the knife he no longer carried. The door creaked open, and a shadow slipped inside. It was the girl, her basket gone, her face half hidden in the gloom. She moved with the silence of a cat, her eyes scanning the room. The other men slept, their snores a low rumble, but Cassian sat up, his heart pounding. She froze, her gaze locking with his. For a moment, neither moved, the air taut between them. She raised a finger to her lips, then knelt beside him, her voice a whisper. "You're the Gaul, the one they call the Bear." Cassian nodded, wary. Whisper. "You're the Gaul, the one they call the Bear." Cassian nodded, wary. "What do you want?" he murmured, his voice rough. "Ways." She hesitated, then leaned closer, her breath warm against his ear. "There are those who watch you, who see your strength. Be ready." Before he could reply, she was gone, slipping back into the night, as if she'd never been. Cassian lay back, his mind racing. Her words were a riddle, a spark of something he couldn't name. Be ready. For what? A fight? A betrayal? A chance at something more? He thought of the arena, of the blood that would soon stain its sand. He thought of the girl, of the fire in her eyes, and for the first time in months, he felt a flicker of hope, fragile as a flame in the wind. Morning came too soon, the guards rousing the men with shouts and kicks. Cassian rose, his body stiff, his mind still tangled in the girl's words. As he stepped into the yard, the sun rising over the Colosseum's arches, he felt the weight of his chains, but also something new, a purpose, faint but growing. He was a slave, a gladiator, a man marked for death, but he was not yet broken. The kitchen was a furnace, its air thick with the scent of garlic, cumin, and sizzling oil. Zoe knelt by the hearth, her hands blackened from tending the fire, her dark hair clinging to her sweat-damp brow. At 19, she was one of a dozen slaves in the culinary heart of Senator Gaius Marcellus's villa, a sprawling complex on the Esquiline Hill where the elite dined on dishes that mocked the hunger of Rome's poor. Zoe, born in a village near Antioch, had been torn from her family at 12, sold to a merchant who saw profit in her quick hands and sharp mind. Now she was here, stirring a pot of lentils, her life bound to the rhythm of chopping, boiling, and serving. The kitchen was a chaos of motion, slaves darting between tables laden with amphorae of wine, baskets of figs, and slabs of raw pork. The head cook, A grizzled freedman named Paulus bellowed orders, his voice cutting through the clatter of bronze pans. "Zoe, the garum now," he snapped, pointing to a clay jug of fermented fish sauce, Rome's prized condiment. Zoe scrambled to obey, her coarse tunic snagging on a splintered table edge. She poured the pungent liquid into a simmering sauce, its sharp tang mingling with the rosemary and coriander she'd added earlier. Cooking was her duty, but it was also her refuge, a place where her hands could create something whole in a world that broke her daily. Zoe's true gift, though, lay hid in a small pouch tied beneath her tunic. She kept a collection of dried herbs, fennel, chamomile, and rare Syrian mint, smuggled from a trader who pitied her. These were not for the senator's table but for the slaves who suffered in silence. A feverish child in the stables, a scullery maid with a festering cut. Zoe's mother had been a healer, her knowledge passed down through whispered lessons under starlit skies. In Rome, that knowledge was dangerous. A slave who knew too much could be branded a witch, flogged, or worse. Yet Zoe could not turn away from those who needed her, not when their eyes mirrored her own quiet despair. The kitchen door swung open, admitting a gust of cool air and the figure of Drusus, the freedman who oversaw the household. His presence silenced the room, slaves bowing their heads as he strode through, his sandals slapping the stone floor. Zoe kept her gaze down, her heart quickening. Drusus had a nose for trouble, and Zoe's secret weighed heavy, the pouch a burning weight against her skin. The master's guests arrive at dusk, Drusus announced, his voice sharp. "A banquet for the prefect. No mistakes, or you'll all feel the whip." He paused near Zoe, his eyes narrowing. "You, Syrian, clean yourself up. You'll serve tonight." Zoe nodded, her throat tight. Serving meant leaving the kitchen's relative safety, stepping into the triclinium where Marcellus and his guests reclined, their laughter fueled by wine and power. She had served before, her hands steady as she poured, her face a mask to hide the fear. But tonight felt different. The air charged with a tension she couldn't name. As Drusus left, Paulus shoved a tray of roasted dormice into her hands. "Move." Gorodsin ludded lus into her hands. "Move, girl." He growled. He growled. Zoe set the tray aside, her mind racing. Serving was a chance to listen, to glean scraps of information about the senator's plans, the city's unrest, or the network of slaves she'd heard whispers of. A shadow moving through Rome's underbelly. The day wore on, the kitchen a blur of heat and noise. Zoe worked tirelessly, grinding pepper, kneading dough, and slipping a pinch of chamomile into a slave boy's broth when Paulus wasn't looking. The boy, a gaunt figure named Felix, had been coughing for days, his small frame racked by fever. Zoe had seen too many like him die, their bodies carted away like refuse. She couldn't save them all, but she could try. As she passed Felix the broth, their eyes met, and he mouthed a silent thank you. Zoe turned away, her chest tight with a mix of fear and resolve. As dusk fell, Zoe washed her face in a basin, scrubbing the soot from her skin. She tied her hair back, her fingers trembling. The banquet was a world apart from the kitchen, a place of silk cushions, gilded cups, and men who saw her as less than human. She joined the line of serving slaves, their faces pale in the torchlight, and followed them to the triclinium. The room was a riot of color, frescoes of Bacchus and nymphs, mosaics of sea creatures, the air heavy with myrrh and roasted meat. Marcellus reclined at the center, his toga pristine, his laughter loud as he toasted the prefect, a stern man with a scar across his cheek. Zoe moved silently, pouring wine, clearing plates, her eyes darting to the shadows. She noticed another slave, a girl with quick hands and a familiar face, slipping a scrap of bread to a child hidden behind a curtain. It was the same girl Zoe had seen delivering supplies to the stables, her movements purposeful, her gaze sharp. Zoe's pulse quickened. Was this the network, the whisper of resistance she'd heard about? She wanted to speak, to ask, but the risk was too great. Instead, she memorized the girl's face, her dark eyes a mirror of Zoe's own. The banquet stretched into the night, the guests growing drunker, their voices louder. Marcellus spoke of Trajan's wars, of Dacian gold filling Rome's coffers, of slaves pouring into the city like rats. Zoe listened, her hands steady as she refilled his cup. She heard names, senators, merchants, a lanista who trained gladiators for the Colosseum. One name caught her ear, Quintus, spoken with a sneer by the prefect. His new Gaul is a beast, the prefect said, draining his wine. They call him the bear. He'll die well in the arena. Zoe's mind flashed to the gladiator she'd seen once, delivering bread to the Ludus Magnus, his green eyes fierce even in chains. Was he the bear? And was the girl part of his world? A crash broke her thoughts, a cup knocked over by a drunken guest. Wine spilled across the mosaic, and Drusus was there in an instant, his face thunderous. Clumsy fool, he hissed, seizing a young slave by the arm. The boy, no older than Felix, whimpered as Drusus raised his hand. Zoe acted without thinking, stepping forward. It was my fault, she lied, her voice low but firm. Drusus turned, his eyes boring into hers. Yours, Syrian, he said, his tone laced with suspicion. Zoe nodded, her heart pounding. I bumped the table. The room grew quiet, the guests watching with amusement. Marcellus waved a hand. Bored, punish her and be done with it, he said, returning to his conversation. Drusus grabbed Zoe's wrist, dragging her to the courtyard. The night air was cold, the stars hidden by clouds. You think you're clever? Drusus snarled, raising his whip. Zoe braced herself, her eyes fixed on the ground. The lash fell once, twice, the pain a white-hot line across her back. She bit her lip, refusing to cry out. When it was over, Drusus shoved her toward the kitchen. Back to work, he spat. Zoe stumbled inside, her vision blurred with tears. Paulus glanced at her, his face unreadable, then turned away. She sank to her knees by the hearth, her hands shaking as she stirred the lentils. The pouch of herbs pressed against her skin. Sen, a reminder of her purpose. She thought of Felix, of the girl at the banquet, of the gladiator called the bear. They were threads in a tapestry she couldn't yet see. But she felt their weight. As the kitchen quieted, but she felt their weight. As the kitchen quieted, Zoe slipped a sprig of mint into her mouth, its sharp taste grounding her. She would survive this night, and the next, and the one after that. And maybe, just maybe, she would find a way to weave those threads into something more. The air in the mine was a living thing, heavy and damp, clinging to Titus's skin like a second tunic. At 16, he was small for his age, his frame wiry from years of hunger, but his hands were calloused, his shoulders broad from months of swinging a pickaxe. The Las Medullas gold mine, a scar on the hills of Hispania, was a world of darkness and dust, its tunnels burrowing deep into the earth. Titus moved through the narrow shaft, his oil lamp casting a feeble glow on the rough-hewn walls. The clink of iron against stone echoed around him, a chorus of labor that never ceased, day or night. He was one of hundreds, slaves and condemned men, toiling for Rome's insatiable hunger for gold. Titus had been born in Rome, the son of a slave woman who died when he was 5. Raised in the shadows of the Suburras and Sulla, he'd known nothing but servitude, his life a series of masters, each crueler than the last. 6 months ago, a theft, a loaf of bread snatched from a market stall, had earned him a sentence to the mines, a punishment worse than death for most. The air was thick with silica dust, coating his lungs, and the tunnels were treacherous, prone to collapse. Yet Titus endured, driven by a stubborn spark he couldn't name, a refusal to let Rome grind him to nothing. He swung his pickaxe, the impact jarring his arms. The vein of ore glinted faintly, a promise of wealth he would never touch. Around him, other slaves worked in silence, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. The overseer, a brutish man named Varro, patrolled the shaft, his whip coiled at his belt. "Faster, you rats," Varro barked, his voice muffled by the stone. Titus kept his head down, his rhythm steady. To pause was to invite the lash, and he bore enough scars already, crisscrossing his back like a map of his suffering. The mine was a labyrinth, its tunnels stretching for miles, some flooded by the Romans' ingenious water channels, others dry and choking. Titus had learned its secrets quickly, the creak of a beam signaling a cave-in, the flicker of a lamp warning of bad air. He'd seen men die, crushed by falling rock or suffocated by fumes, their bodies left where they fell until the shift ended. Survival demanded vigilance, but it also demanded trust, a rare currency among the damned. Titus had found it in Cato, an older slave with a limp and a wry smile, who worked the same shaft. Cato had taught him to listen to the mine, to read its moods like a sailor reads the sea. At midday, a horn sounded, signaling a brief rest. Titus slumped against the wall, his lamp sputtering. Cato joined him, passing a skin of brackish water. "You are still breathing, lad," Cato said, his voice rough but warm. "That's something." Titus managed a nod, wiping sweat from his brow. The water tasted of earth, but it was a relief, easing the burn in his throat. He glanced at Cato, whose gray hair was matted with dust, his hands scarred from years underground. "How long you been here?" Titus asked, though he feared the answer. 10 years, Cato said, his eyes distant. "Was a scribe once, in Alexandria, wrote for a priest till he crossed a senator. Now I'm here." Titus stared, trying to imagine Cato with a quill instead of a pickaxe. A scribe, like the woman he'd heard whispers of, a Greek in Rome, who moved grain to feed the starving. The thought stirred something in him, a flicker of connection to a world beyond the mine. "Ever think of getting out?" Titus asked, his voice low. Cato's smile faded. "Think of it every day. But these hills swallow dreams as quick as men." The break ended, and Varro's shout drove them back to work. Titus swung his pickaxe, his mind drifting. He thought of Rome, of the city he'd left behind, its streets alive with noise and color. He thought of the stories he'd heard, of gladiators fighting for freedom, of slaves who defied their masters in secret. He wondered if the scribe was real, if she was part of the network Cato had mentioned once. A group of slaves passing messages, stealing moments of power. The idea was dangerous, but it warmed him, a light in the mind's endless dark. Hours later, as the shift neared its end, Titus's pickaxe struck something odd. Not the dull thud of rock, but a sharp clink. He froze, his lamp raised. The wall glittered, not with gold but with a strange, milky stone, veined with blue. He chipped away, revealing a small cavity, and inside, a glint of metal. His heart raced as he reached in, his fingers closing around a cold, smooth object, a bronze amulet, shaped like a crescent moon, its surface etched with symbols he couldn't read. It was old, older than the mine, a relic of a people Rome had buried. Titus glanced around, ensuring Varro was out of sight. He tucked the amulet into his tunic, its weight a secret he could barely comprehend. Was it valuable, a charm, a curse? He didn't know, but it felt like a sign, a piece of the world above ground. Cato noticed his tension, his eyes narrowing. "What'd you find, lad?" he whispered. Titus hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing." He lied, his voice barely audible. Cato didn't press, but his gaze lingered, heavy with understanding. The horn sounded, and the slaves shuffled toward the surface, their lamps bobbing like fireflies. The climb was grueling, the air growing lighter, but no less oppressive. Cato noticed his tension. At the mouth of the mine, the night sky opened above them, a vast expanse of stars that mocked their chains. Titus clutched the amulet through his tunic, its edges sharp against his skin. He thought of the scribe, of the gladiator called the Bear, of the Syrian girl he'd seen once in the Subura, her hands stained with herbs. Were they all connected, bound by something greater than their suffering? Varro herded them to the barracks, a cluster of mud brick huts surrounded by a palisade. Titus collapsed onto his straw mat, the amulet hidden beneath his pallet. Cato sat nearby, sharpening a tool with a stone, his eyes on Titus. "Careful, lad," he said softly. "Secrets down here don't stay buried long." Titus nodded, his throat tight. He didn't know what the amulet meant, but it was his, a piece of defiance in a world that owned him. As he closed his eyes, the mind's weight settled over him, but so did a new resolve. He would survive, and he would learn what the amulet held, whether it was salvation or doom. The atrium of Senator Gaius Marcellus's villa was a stage, its marble columns and shimmering fountain, a backdrop for power. Livia stood at its edge, her ledger clutched to her chest, her ink-stained fingers hidden beneath the folds of her tunic. Dawn had barely broken, the sky a bruise of purple over Rome, but the household was already stirring. Slaves sweeping the mosaic floors, freedmen murmuring about the day's tasks. Livia, now 23 and 3 years into her service as Marcellus's scribe, felt the weight of her secret like a stone in her gut. The scrap of papyrus, tucked inside her tunic, held the latest tally of stolen grain, 50 modia, redirected to a tenement in the Subura where slaves and freedmen starved. Kedia, it was her boldest act yet, and the most dangerous. Her quill had been her shield, her education a chain that bound her to this villa rather than the fields or mines. But that shield was cracking. The network, a fragile web of slaves passing messages and supplies, had grown bolder, and Livia was its scribe, recording their moves in a code hidden within Marcellus's own ledgers. "A missing amphora here?" A miscounted sack there, small thefts that fed dozens. She thought of Zoe, the Syrian cook whose herbs healed the sick, and the girl who moved like a shadow, delivering bread and whispers. Livia didn't know their full names, only their roles, but they were her strength, her reason to risk everything. The summons had come at first light, delivered by Drusus, the freedman whose eyes missed nothing. "The master wants you," he'd said, his tone sharp with suspicion. Now, Livia waited, her heart a drum beat against her ribs. The atrium's frescoes, gods and heroes frozen in paint, seemed to watch her, their gazes as cold as the marble beneath her feet. She adjusted her stance, the iron collar around her neck chafing her skin. It was a light collar, a mark of her value, but a collar nonetheless, a reminder that she was property, her life a thread in Marcellus's hands. Footsteps echoed, and Marcellus appeared, his toga crisp, his face a mask of controlled anger. He was 40, broad-shouldered, with a jaw like a legionary's shield, his wealth built on grain and influence. Behind him stood Drusus, his shadow, and a stranger, a thin man in a dark tunic, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. Livia bowed her head, her ledger a shield against their scrutiny. "You called for me, Domine," she said, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her chest. Marcellus paced, his sandals clicking on the mosaic. "My accounts," he said, his voice low but edged with steel. "They're off, again." Livia's breath caught, but she kept her face blank, a skill honed over years. "I've checked the ledgers, Domine," she said, lifting the bound papyrus. "Every modius of grain, every denarius of tax. It's recorded." Marcellus stopped, his eyes boring into hers. "And yet," he said, "my stores are lighter than they should be. 50 modia, gone. Explain." Livia's mind raced, her thoughts a tangle of numbers and lies. She had buried the theft in her code, a system of subtle errors, overstated shipments, understated deliveries, that only she could decipher. But Marcellus was no fool, and Drusus's suspicions were a net closing around her. "There may be errors in the shipments from Ostia," she said, her tone deferential. "The portmasters are careless. I can recalculate, Domine, and send a query to the docks." It was a plausible lie, one she'd used before, but the stranger's presence unnerved her. Who was he? A merchant? A spy? The stranger stepped forward, his voice smooth as oil. "I am Lucius, an auditor from the Imperial Treasury. The Emperor's agents have noted discrepancies in your accounts. Senate, Trajan's wars require gold, and every grain counts." Livia's heart sank. An imperial auditor was a blade, cutting through excuses. Marcellus's face darkened, his anger shifting from Livia to Lucius. "My household is in order," he snapped. "This Greek is the best scribe in Rome. If there's a fault, it's not hers." Livia's relief was fleeting. Marcellus's defense was not trust but pride. He could not admit a slave had outwitted him. She lowered her eyes, her fingers tightening on the ledger. The scrap of papyrus burned against her skin, its coded tally a death sentence if found. Drusus spoke, his voice a blade of its own. "She's clever, Domine, but clever slaves bear watching. I've seen her scribbling late, alone." Livia's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to breathe. "I work to serve you, Domine," she said softly. "The ledgers are complex. I stay late to ensure accuracy." Marcellus waved a hand, impatient. "Enough, Lucius. You'll have your numbers by week's end." "Livia," Recalculate every shipment from the past month. No sleep until it's done. He turned to Drusus, his tone cold. Watch her. If she falters, it's your head. Drusus nodded, his eyes never leaving Livia. Lucius said nothing, but his gaze lingered, sharp and unreadable. As the men departed, Livia exhaled, her legs trembling beneath her tunic. She had bought time, but at a cost. Drusus's suspicion was now a leash, and Lucius's presence a storm on the horizon. She retreated to her cubiculum, the narrow cell where she worked and slept. The oil lamp flickered, casting shadows on the walls. She set the ledger on her desk, her hands shaking as she opened it. The numbers stared back, her code a fragile shield. She thought of the network, of the girl who'd passed a message last week. A folded cloth, its stitches hiding words. Grain to the Aventine. Dusk. Livia had arranged the theft, her heart pounding as she altered the ledger. Now, that act felt like a noose tightening around her neck. A soft knock broke her thoughts. She tensed, slipping the scrap of papyrus beneath the ledger. The door creaked open, revealing the girl from the network, her dark hair tied back, her eyes bright with urgency. Livia knew her only as Mira, a name that might be false. You're in danger, Mira whispered, stepping inside. Drusus is asking questions. He's watching the stores. Livia's stomach twisted. I covered the last shipment, she said, her voice low. But there's an auditor now, Imperial. Mira's face paled, but her resolve held. We need you, Livia. The Sabura's starving, and the mines. She stopped, glancing at the door. There's a boy, Titus, in Hispania. He found something. We don't know what, but it's important. Livia's mind flashed to the mines, to the stories of slaves buried alive. A boy named Titus, was he part of this? And what had he found? I can't stop, Livia said, her voice fierce despite her fear. But I need time. Tell the others to hold. No moves until I signal. Mira nodded, slipping a small vial into Livia's hand. From the Syrian, she said, for strength. Livia recognized Zoe's work, the faint scent of chamomile and mint. She tucked the vial away, her heart swelling with gratitude. They were strangers, yet bound by a shared fight. Mira left as silently as she'd come, and Livia returned to the ledger, her quill moving with renewed purpose. She would recalculate, bury her code deeper, and protect the network. But Drusus's eyes were on her, and Lucius's arrival was a warning. Rome was a beast, and she was its prey. As night fell, the villa quieted, the only sound the scratch of her quill. Livia whispered, Sappho's words, a talisman against despair. Someone will remember us, I say, even in another time. She thought of Zoe, of Titus, of the gladiator called the Bear. They were her people, her reason to keep fighting, and fight she would, until the beast devoured her, or she slipped its jaws. The Colosseum's roar was a beast, a living tide of sound that crashed over Cassian. As he stepped onto the arena's sand, the sun blazed overhead, its heat a hammer against his bronze helmet. The Murmillo's heavy armor, greaves, manica, and shield weighing on his scarred frame. At 26, Cassian, the Gaul known as the Bear, was no stranger to battle, but the arena was a different war. Here, death was spectacle, and he was its star, his life a coin tossed for Rome's amusement. The crowd, 50,000 strong, bayed for blood, their cheers a thunder that drowned the pounding of his heart. He gripped his gladius, its blade honed to a razor's edge, and scanned the arena. The sand was raked smooth, stained with the morning's fights, the air thick with the scent of sweat, iron, and fear. Across from him stood his opponent, a retiarius named Cyrus, a wiry Syrian with a trident and net, his eyes glinting through the slits of his visor. Cyrus was fast, deadly, a favorite of the crowd for his cunning. Cassian had sparred with him in the Ludus Magnus, knew his tricks, but the arena was no training yard. Here, only one would walk away. The Lanista, Quintus, had chosen this fight for Senator Marcellus's banquet, a private spectacle, to curry favor with Trajan's prefect. Cassian had heard the whispers, Marcellus's grain shortages, his temper flaring, his auditor sniffing for theft. None of that mattered now. All that existed was the sand, the blade, and the man who wanted him dead. The editor, a minor official in a purple-trimmed toga, raised his hand from the pulvinus, signaling the start. The start. The sound. The crowd's roar peaked, and Cyrus charged, his net spinning in a deadly arc. Cassian raised his shield, the net glancing off its bronze edge. Cyrus's trident thrust followed, a blur of steel aimed at Cassian's thigh. He pivoted, the strike grazing his greave, and countered with a slash of his gladius. Cyrus danced back, light on his feet, his laughter sharp, slow. Bear, he taunted, circling. Cassian didn't reply, his focus a blade of its own. He advanced, shield high, forcing Cyrus to move. The Retiarius was agile, but his armor was light, his chest bare. One solid hit could end it. The crowd chanted, "Bear, bear," their voices a pulse that drove Cassian forward. He lunged, feinting left, then struck right, his gladius nicking Cyrus's arm. Blood sprayed, bright against the sand, and the crowd roared. Cyrus hissed, his net lashing out, tangling Cassian's shield. The trident stabbed, grazing Cassian's shoulder. The trident stabbed, grazing Cassian's shoulder. The pain a white-hot spark. He yanked his shield free, sand flying, and charged, slamming Cyrus with his full weight. The Retiarius stumbled, his trident skittering across the sand. Cassian raised his blade, poised to strike. "Kill, kill," the crowd screamed. But Cassian hesitated, his eyes meeting Cyrus's. They were slaves, brothers in chains, their lives pitted against each other for sport. Cyrus's gaze held no plea, only defiance, a mirror of Cassian's own. The editor's voice cut through the den. "Spare him," the crowd groaned, some cheering, as Cyrus was dragged away, alive but defeated. Cassian lowered his blade, his chest heaving, the wound on his shoulder a burning line. He had won, but victory tasted of ash. The guards escorted him from the arena, through the hypogeum's dark tunnels, where the stench of blood and animal dung clung to the stone. In the Ludus's infirmary, a grizzled medic stitched his wound, the needle biting as Cassian sat in silence. Quintus appeared, his scar-twisted face grit. "You fought well, Gaul," he said, tossing Cassian a small purse of coins. "The senators pleased. Keep winning, and that Rudis is yours." Cassian nodded, the promise hollow. Freedom was a lie for most. A carrot dangled to keep them fighting. Night fell, The ludus quiet save for the groans of injured men. Cassian lay on his straw mat, the coins heavy in his hand. He thought of the girl, Mira, who'd slipped into the barracks weeks ago. Her cryptic words, "Be ready," still a riddle. He thought of the Syrian cook, Zoe, whose herbs had reached him once, easing a fever after a fight. He thought of the scribe, Livia, whose name he'd overheard in the ludus's whispers, a woman stealing grain for the starving. Were they all part of Mira's network? A shadow moving through Rome's chains. A soft scrape at the door broke his thoughts. He tensed, his hand closing around the coins, a makeshift weapon. The door opened, and Mira slipped inside, her tunic patched, her eyes sharp in the lamplight. She knelt beside him, her voice a whisper. "You survived," she said, relief flickering in her gaze. Cassian sat up, wary. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low. Mira glanced at the sleeping gladiators, then leaned closer. "The network needs you, Bear. Your strength, your name. It draws eyes. We're moving something big." Cassian's jaw tightened. "I'm no hero," he said. "I fight to live, nothing more." Mira's eyes softened, but her tone was firm. "You're more than a blade, Cassian. The mines, the Sabura, they're starving, and we're fighting back." A boy, Titus, found something in Hispania. It could change things. Cassian's mind flashed to the mines, to the stories of slaves buried alive. A boy named Titus. What had he found, and how did it tie to him? Mira pressed a small vial into his hand. Its scent familiar. Chamomile. Mint. Chamomile. Chamomile. Mint. Chamomile. Chamomile. Mint. Zoe's work. "For the pain," she said, "and a sign you're not alone." Before he could reply, she was gone, her steps silent on the stone. Chamomile. Cassian clutched the vial, its weight a lifeline. He thought of his village, of the Gaul he'd been, of the sister he'd lost to Rome's swords. The arena had hardened him, but Mira's words cracked that armor, letting hope seep through. Fragged that armor, letting hope seep through. Fragile but persistent. Morning came, the ludus stirring with shouts and the clash of training swords. Cassian rose, his shoulders stiff but bearable, the vial hidden beneath his mat. As he stepped into the yard, the Colosseum's shadow loomed, a reminder of the fights to come. But now, he carried something new, a purpose, faint but growing. He was a slave, a gladiator, a man marked for death. But he was not alone, and that changed everything. The kitchen's heat was a living thing, wrapping Zoe in a cocoon of steam and spice as she ground coriander seeds with a mortar and pestle. At 19, she was a shadow in Senator Gaius Marcellus's villa, her hands quick and her presence unremarkable, save for the pouch of herbs hidden beneath her tunic, a secret that could heal or destroy her. The air was thick with the scent of roasting peacock and garum, Rome's pungent fish sauce, as the household prepared for another banquet. Zoe's back still ached from Drusus's whip, the welts a reminder of her reckless lie to protect a boy at the last feast. Yet she worked on, her hands steady, her heart a quiet storm. The kitchen was a battlefield, its stone counters littered with amphorae of olive oil, baskets of pomegranates, and trays of honeyed cakes. Paulus, the head cook, barked orders, his face red from wine and heat. "Zoe, the sauce, don't let it curdle," he shouted, tossing a handful of dill into her pot. She nodded, stirring the mixture of wine and herbs. Her mind elsewhere, she thought of Felix, the slave boy whose fever had broken after her chamomile broth. Now back to scrubbing pots. She thought of Mira, the girl who moved like a ghost, carrying messages for the network that Zoe had joined in whispers. A network that stole grain, hid runaways, and dreamed of defiance. Her herbs were her weapon, a legacy from her mother in Syria, where healing was a sacred art. In Rome, it was a risk. Slaves who knew too much were threats. Their skills a double-edged blade. Zoe had been careful, slipping remedies to those in need. A stable hand with a cough, a maid with a burn, always under Paulus's nose. But word was spreading, and eyes were turning. Yesterday, a freed woman had asked for a salve, her tone too knowing. Zoe had refused, fear tightening her throat, but the request lingered, a warning. The kitchen door swung open, and Drusus entered, his presence a chill in the heat. The slaves fell silent, their heads bowed as he strode through, his eyes scanning for fault. Zoe kept her gaze on the pot, her pulse quickening. Drusus had watched her since the banquet, his suspicion a shadow she couldn't shake. "Syrian," he said, stopping beside her. "The mistress wants you." Now, Zoe's heart lurched. The mistress, Claudia, Marcellus's wife, was a rare presence, her life confined to the women's quarters. To be summoned by her was unheard of, a step into a world Zoe didn't belong in. She wiped her hands on her tunic, the pouch of herbs a burning weight against her skin. Paulus shot her a glance, half curious, half wary, as she followed Drusus out. The villa's corridors were a maze of frescoes and flickering lamps, the air cooler but no less oppressive. Drusus said nothing, his silence heavier than words. Zoe's mind raced. Had someone betrayed her? Had her herbs been noticed? She thought of Livia, the scribe whose coded ledgers hid the network's thefts, and Mira, who delivered Zoe's vial to a gladiator called the Bear. Were they safe, or was this the moment the network unraveled? Claudia's chamber was a world apart, its walls draped with silk, its air scented with rosewater. The mistress reclined on a cushioned couch, her hair coiled in elaborate curls, her stola a cascade of blue. A girl, no older than 10, sat at her feet, her face pale and drawn. Marcellus's daughter, Flavia. Salvia. Zoe bowed, her eyes on the mosaic floor. Howl, dolphins and waves a mockery of freedom. You were the cook, Claudia said, her voice soft but sharp. Thaw, the one with herbs. Zoe's stomach twisted, but she nodded, her voice steady. I serve in the kitchen, Domina. Claudia's eyes narrowed, studying Zoe like a merchant appraising goods. Claudia's eyes narrowed, studying Zoe like a merchant appraising goods. Hull, my daughter is ill, she said. Fevers, headaches, the physicians are useless. Their potions worse than nothing. I've heard you know remedies. Zoe's breath caught. This was no request but a command, and refusal was not an option. Yet to agree was to step into a trap. If Flavia worsened, Zoe would bear the blame, flogging, exile, or worse. But if she succeeded, her skills would be exposed, her secret laid bare. I know some herbs, Domina, Zoe said cautiously. I can try to help. Claudia gestured to Flavia, who coughed weakly, her eyes glassy. Zoe knelt beside the girl, her hands gentle as she felt her forehead. Hot, too hot. Fever, Zoe murmured, her mind racing through her mother's lessons. Chamomile to cool, willow bark for pain, mint for the nausea that often followed. Her pouch held enough, but using it here, under Claudia's gaze, was a risk she couldn't measure. Fetch what you need, Claudia said, her tone impatient. Zoe hesitated, then nodded, rising. Dresses escorted her back to the kitchen, his eyes never leaving her. She retrieved a small clay pot, slipping chamomile and mint from her pouch when his back was turned. Back in the chamber, she brewed a tea, the steam rising in delicate curls. Flavia sipped it, grimacing at the taste, but her breathing eased, her face less pinched. Claudia watched, her expression unreadable. If she improves, she said, you'll serve me again. If not, she let the threat hang, a blade in the air. Zoe bowed, her heart pounding as she left the chamber. The villa's corridors felt tighter now, the walls closing in. She had saved Flavia, for now, but at what cost? Claudia's interest was a chain, binding her to the household's heart, and Dressus's gaze was sharper than ever, his suspicion a net she couldn't escape. As she returned to the kitchen, Paulus greeted her with a grunt. Trouble follows you, Syrian, he said, tossing her a leek to chop. Zoe worked in silence, her hands trembling. She thought of Mira, of the network's next move, a shipment to the Aventine, planned for dusk. She thought of the gladiator, Cassian, whose strength Mira had praised, and the boy, Titus, in the mines, whose discovery she'd yet to understand. Night fell, the kitchen quieting as the banquet began. Zoe slipped into the courtyard, her breath misting in the cool air. Mira was there, a shadow by the fountain, her eyes bright with urgency. The mistress called for you, she whispered. It's dangerous, Zoe. They're watching closer now. Zoe nodded, her throat tight. I had no choice, she said, but Flavia's better. It might buy us time. Mira pressed a scrap of cloth into her hand, its stitches hiding a message. For Livia, she said. The Aventine's ready. She said. Be careful. Mira vanished, and Zoe tucked the cloth into her tunic. Next to the pouch, she thought of her mother, of the Syrian nights when healing was a gift, not a crime. She thought of Felix, of the slaves she'd helped, of the network binding them all. As she returned to the kitchen, the stars above were cold, but her resolve burnt. She was a slave, a cook, a healer in a world that owned her. But she was also a spark, and she would not let Rome snuff her out. The mine's darkness was a weight, pressing against Titus's chest as he swung his pickaxe into the unyielding rock. At 16, he was a ghost in the Las Medullas gold mine, his wiry frame dusted with silica, his lungs burning with every breath. The tunnel was narrow, its walls slick with damp, the air thick with the sour tang of sweat and earth. His oil lamp flickered, casting shadows that danced like specters on the stone. Around him, the clatter of iron and the grunts of other slaves filled the shaft, a relentless rhythm that marked their lives. Titus was one of many, a Roman-born slave sentenced to this underworld for a stolen loaf. His existence reduced to the ore he pried from the earth, the bronze amulet. Hidden beneath his ragged tunic was a secret that burned brighter than his lamp, found days ago in a cavity of milky stone. Its crescent shape and etched symbols were a mystery, a relic of a world Rome had crushed. Titus had told no one, not even Cato, the older slave whose wry wisdom kept him sane. The amulet was his, a spark of defiance in a life owned by others. but it was also a danger. If Viro, the brutal overseer, found it, Titus would face the whip or worse, the cross. Tata. Yet he couldn't let it go, its weight a reminder that he was more than a tool. He struck the rock, the impact jarring his arms. The vein of gold glinted faintly, a cruel tease of wealth that fed Trajan's wars while Titus starved. Cato worked beside him, his limp more pronounced today, his breaths ragged. Easy, lad, Cato murmured, his voice barely audible over the din. Save your strength. Titus nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. Cato was his anchor, a former scribe whose stories of Alexandria gave Titus glimpses of a world beyond the mine. But Cato was weakening, his cough worsening, and Titus feared the day he'd lose him. The shaft trembled, a low groan echoing through the stone. Titus froze, his heart lurching. The mine was a living beast, its moods unpredictable. Cave-ins were common, the tunnels carved by Rome's water channels fragile as glass. He glanced at Cato, whose eyes were wide, his pickaxe stick. Bad air, Titus whispered, his lamp flickering. Cato shook his head, listening. No, something's shifting. Before Titus could reply, a crack split the air, sharp as a whip. Dust rained down, and the tunnel shuddered, a deep rumble rising from below. Cato shouted, grabbing Titus's arm. The other slaves scrambled, their lamps bobbing as they fled toward the main shaft. Titus stumbled, his foot catching on a rock, the amulet swinging against his chest. A beam above groaned, splintering, and a cascade of stone blocked the path ahead. Screams echoed, cut short by the crush of rock. Titus's lamp fell, its flames snuffed, plunging them into darkness. He clung to Cato, his breath shallow, the dust choking his lungs. Stay low, Cato rasped, pulling him down. The rumble faded, leaving an eerie silence, broken only by the moans of trapped men. Titus's hands fumbled in the dark, finding Cato's arm. You hurt? He asked, his voice hoarse. Not yet, Cato said, coughing, but we're cut off. Titus's mind raced, mapping the tunnel. The main shaft was blocked, but a side passage, narrow and unstable, led to an older tunnel. It was a risk. Collapse was likely, but staying meant suffocation. He felt for the amulet, its cool metal grounding him. There's a way, he said. The old shaft, it's close. Cato's silence was heavy, but he nodded. Lead, lad. Titus crawled, his hands scraping the jagged floor, guided by memory and touch. The air grew thinner, the darkness absolute. Behind them, voices cried out, some praying to gods. Titus didn't know. He thought of Rome, of the Subura's crowded streets, of the scribe Livia, whose grain fed the starving. He thought of Zoe, the Syrian whose herbs had reached the mines once, a vial passed by a traitor. He thought of Cassian, the gladiator called the Bear, whose name was a whisper of strength. Were they all linked, bound by the network Cato had hinted at? The passage narrowed, the walls closing in. Titus's shoulders brushed stone, his breath loud in his ears. Cato followed, his coughs sharp, his strength fading. A faint glow appeared ahead, a sliver of light from a ventilation shaft. Titus pushed forward, his hands raw, until the passage widened into the old tunnel. The air was stale but breathable, the walls scarred by ancient picks. He helped Cato sit, his lamp long gone, the light from above barely enough to see. We're alive, Titus said, his voice trembling with relief. But the voices from the blocked shaft haunted him. At least a dozen men were trapped, their cries growing weaker. Titus knew the mine's cruelty. Varro wouldn't risk more lives for slaves. The trapped men would die, their bodies left to rot. He looked at Cato, whose face was gray, his eyes distant. "We can't leave them," Titus said, his voice fierce. Cato shook his head. "You go back, you die. That's the mine's law." Titus's jaw tightened. He thought of the amulet, of its symbols. Maybe a charm, maybe a curse. He thought of the network, of the boy he was, stealing bread to survive. He couldn't save everyone, but he could try. "I'm going," Titus said, standing. Cato grabbed his wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "You're not alone. The network, they're watching. That amulet, it's more than you know." Titus stared, his heart pounding. "What is it?" he asked, but Cato only coughed, waving him off. "Go, but be quick. I'll wait." Titus nodded, his resolve hardening. He crawled back through the passage, the darkness swallowing him. He crawled back through the passage, the darkness swallowing him. The amulet a pulse against his chest. The blocked shaft was a chaos of dust and moans. Titus worked by touch, pulling stones away, his hands bleeding. He found a man, half buried, his breath shallow. "Hold on," Titus whispered, digging faster. The rocks shifted, a small gap opening. He dragged the man free, then another, their weight heavy but alive. The others were beyond saving, their voices silent. Titus's strength waned, his vision blurring, but he kept moving, driven by a fire he didn't understand. Varro's shout broke through, the overseer's lamp piercing the dark. "Who's there?" he bellowed. Titus froze. The rescued men slumped beside him. If Varro found the amulet, or suspected defiance, Titus was finished. But he stood, his voice steady. "It's me, Titus. I got him out." Varro's eyes narrowed, his whip uncoiled. "Fool," he spat. "You'll answer for this." Titus braced for the lash, but the rescued men stirred, their gratitude a shield. Varro cursed, herding them to the surface, Titus among them. At the mine's mouth, the night air was a shock, the stars a cold witness. Titus collapsed, his hands raw, the amulet safe but heavy. Cato was there, carried by another slave, his smile faint but proud. "You did it, lad," he said, coughing. Titus nodded, his throat tight. He had saved 2 lives, but the mine had claimed more. He thought of the network, of Cato's words about the amulet. Was it a key, a signal, a link to Livia, Zoe, Cassie? As Varro's whip cracked, marking the survivors for punishment, Titus clutched the amulet, its mystery his strength. He was a slave, a miner, a boy in a world of stone. But he had chosen, and that choice changed everything. The oil lamp's flame was a frail thing, flickering in the draft that crept through Livia's cubiculum, casting shadows across the walls of Senator Gaius Marcellus's villa. Livia, at 23, sat hunched over her ledger, her quill scratching numbers that hid a dangerous truth. The air smelled of wax and ink, tinged with the faint rot of the Tiber beyond the Esquiline hill. Her fingers, stained black, trembled as she wrote, not from fatigue but from fear. The network, a clandestine web of slaves stealing grain, passing messages, and shielding runaways, had been her lifeline, her defiance against Rome's chains. But now, that web was fraying, and Livia, its scribe, stood at the edge of ruin. Her ledger was a masterpiece of deception. its columns of grain shipments and taxes masking the network's thefts. Mitstachthi Modric's thefts. 50 modia here, 100 there. Siphoned to the Subura's starving tenements, or the Avantane's hidden safe houses. Livia's code, a system of subtle errors, had kept them safe until now. Until now, the imperial auditor, Lucius, had lingered in the villa for days, his hawkish eyes dissecting her work. Drusus, the freedman who managed the slaves, was a constant shadow, his suspicion a blade at her throat. And Mira, the girl who carried the network's whispers, had brought word of a new threat, a traitor among them. Someone selling secrets for bread or freedom. Livia's heart pounded as she tucked a scrap of papyrus into her tunic. Its coded tally of the latest theft, 80 modia, bound for the Aventine. Her most reckless act yet. She thought of Zoe, the Syrian cook whose herbs healed the sick, and Cassian, the gladiator called the Bear, whose strength Mira had rallied to their cause. She thought of Titus, the boy in the Hispania mines, whose discovery of a bronze amulet had reached her through Mira's stitched messages. They were her people, bound by a shared fight, but trust was a luxury they could ill afford. Who had turned, a cook, a stable hand, one of the Subura's desperate. The betrayal was a poison, and Livia was its target. A knock shattered her thoughts, sharp and urgent. She slipped the scrap beneath the ledger, her breath catching. The door opened, revealing Mira, her face pale, her eyes wide with panic. Livia, she whispered, stepping inside. They know. Drusus has someone, a slave, talking. The Aventine shipments compromised. Livia's stomach lurched, her mind racing. The Aventine was their boldest move, a cache of grain to feed 100 mouths. If Drusus had proof, the network would collapse, and Livia's ledger would be her executioner. Who? Livia asked, her voice low but fierce. Mira shook her head, her hands trembling. I don't know. A boy, maybe Felix, the one Zoe helped. Drusus caught him with a vial. Your herbs, Zoe's work. Livia's heart sank. Felix, the frail kitchen boy she'd seen recover from fever. His gratitude a quiet bond. Had he cracked under Drusus's whip, trading their lives for a moment's mercy? Where's Zoe? Livia asked, rising. Safe, for now, Mira said. But the kitchens watched. We need to move. Livia, destroy the ledger, or we're all dead. Livia's hand tightened on the ledger, its weight a chain. Destroying it would erase her code, her proof of the network's work, but also her guilt. Yet it was Marcellus's record, his wealth, and its loss would bring his wrath. She thought of Sappho's words, her refuge. Someone will remember us, I say, even in another time. She couldn't let their fight be forgotten, not when Titus's amulet, Cassian's strength, and Zoe's herbs were threads in a tapestry of defiance. No, Livia said, her voice steady. We hide it. There's a loose stone in the atrium, behind the fountain. It's safer than burning. Mira nodded, her resolve mirroring Livia's. I'll warn the others. Zoe's ready to act. And Cassian, he's with us. Livia, the bear's ready to fight. Livia's chest tightened, a flicker of hope amidst the fear. Cassian, the gladiator she'd never met, was a name that carried weight. His survival in the arena a spark for their cause. And Titus, she asked. Mira hesitated. His amulet, it's old. Livia, Cato, his friend, says it's Celtic. Maybe a key to something bigger. We need it here, in Rome. Livia's mind spun. Katic amulet, found in Hispania's mines, tied to their network. Could it be a symbol, a map, a weapon, a weapon? Before Mira could say more, footsteps echoed in the corridor, heavy and deliberate. Go, Livia hissed, pushing Mira toward the door. The girl slipped out, her shadow vanishing as Drusus appeared, his face a mask of triumph. Working late, his voice dripping with malice. Livia stood, the ledger open before her hands steady despite the storm within. Thin, the master's accounts, as ordered, she said, her tone deferential. Drusus stepped closer, his eyes flicking to the ledger, then to her, then to her, then to her. You're clever, he said, but not clever enough. Felix talked. Felician's done. Livia's blood ran cold, but she held his gaze. Her face a blank slate. Face a blank slate. I don't know what you mean, she said, her voice calm. Drusus laughed, a harsh sound that filled the room. You will, when Marcellus hears. The auditor's coming, and your numbers won't save you. He grabbed the ledger, flipping through its pages, his fingers smudging the ink. Livia's heart pounded, but she knew her code was invisible to him, its errors too subtle for his untrained eye. Take it to the master, she said. Phil, a gamble. He'll see my work is sound. Drusus Selu failed, his suspicion warring with doubt. He tossed the ledger back. Phil, its pages fluttering. Phil, you'll slip. Greek, he said, turning to leave, and I'll be there. The door closed, and Livia exhaled, her legs trembling. Felix's betrayal was a wound, but Drusus's ignorance was a reprieve. She had to act, hide the ledger, warn Zoe, protect the network. She thought of Titus, of the amulet's mystery, of Cassian's blade, of Zoe's herbs. They were her strength, her reason to fight. Under cover of night, Livia slipped into the atrium, the fountain's murmur masking her steps. She knelt behind it, prying loose a stone with shaking hands. The ledger fit snugly, its secrets safe for now. She replaced the stone, her fingers brushing the cold marble, and whispered Sappho's words. Someone will remember us, I say, even in another time. The betrayal had shaken her, but it hadn't broken her. Felix was a boy, weak and scared, but Livia was a woman forged in loss. She would rebuild the network, protect her people, and face whatever came. Drusus, Lucius, or Marcellus himself. As dawn crept over the villa, Livia returned to her cubiculum, her resolve afire in her chest. The network was wounded, but it lived, and so did she. For now, that was enough. The Ludus, Magnus, was a fortress of stone and sweat, its training yard a crucible where Cassian, at 26, had forged himself into a weapon. The sun beat down, turning the sand to fire beneath his feet, as he swung his gladius in a practiced arc, his murmillo armor, bronze greaves, manica, and heavy shield, clanking with each move. His green eyes, sharp beneath his cropped hair, scanned the yard, where gladiators sparred under the Lanista Quintus's watchful gaze. Cassian, the Gaul called the Bear, was a survivor, His scars a map of battles won in the Colosseum and beyond. But survival was not enough. Not when the promise of Arudis, the wooden sword of freedom, hung like a star he could never reach. The network's whispers had changed him. Mira, the girl who moved like a shadow, had drawn him into their cause. A web of slaves stealing grain, hiding runaways, and dreaming of defiance. Cassian had fought for them in the arena, his victories a distraction for their moves, his name a spark for the Saburas starving. He thought of Livia, the scribe whose coded ledgers hid their thefts, and Zoe, the Syrian cook, whose herbs had eased his wounds. He thought of Titus, the boy in Hispania's mines, whose amulet was a mystery. Mira had called a key, but now, the network was bleeding. Felix, a kitchen boy, had betrayed them, his confession to Drusus, threatening to unravel everything. Cassian's grip tightened on his gladius as he parried a blow from Milo, his Thracian sparring partner. The wooden blade stung, but pain was an old friend. "You're distracted, Bear," Milo said, his grin sharp beneath a bruised cheek. Cassian didn't reply, his focus split between the fight and the weight of Mira's last message. The Aventines lost. Be ready for something bigger. What that meant, he didn't know, but the urgency in her eyes had stirred a fire in him, a purpose beyond the arena's blood-soaked sand. Quintus's shout broke his thoughts. "Bear, to me," Cassian lowered his blade, wiping sweat from his brow, and approached the lanista, whose scar-twisted face was grim. "You've caught a senator's eye," Quintus said, his voice low. "Marcellus himself. He's hosting a private munis at his villa. 3 fights. He's hosting a private munis at his villa. 3 fights. You're the main draw. Win, and he's promised Arudis. Lose, and you're meat." Cassian's heart lurched. Freedom, so close, yet tied to Marcellus, the man whose grain the network had stolen, whose auditor hunted Livia's secrets. The offer was a trap, or a test, but it was also a chance. The day of the munis dawned clear. The villa's courtyard transformed into a small arena, its marble columns draped with garlands, its sand raked smooth. Cassian stood in the holding cell, his armor polished, his gladius heavy in his hand. The crowd, senators, merchants, and Trajan's prefect was small but ravenous, their wine-fueled laughter a stark contrast to the Colosseum's roar. He thought of his village in Gaul, of the sister lost to Rome's swords, of the man he'd been before chains. The network had given him a reason to fight, but freedom was a dream he couldn't let die. The gate opened, and Cassian stepped onto the sand, the crowd's cheers a dull hum. His opponent was a secutor, a stocky Dacian named Varro, whose curved dagger and small shield made him a deadly counter to Cassian's heavy armor. Varro's eyes were cold, his stance low, a predator honed by years in the ludus. The editor, Marcellus himself, raised a hand, his toga gleaming in the torchlight. "Begin," he called, and Varro lunged, his dagger a flash of steel, aimed at Cassian's thigh. Cassian blocked with his shield, the impact jarring his arm, and countered with a slash that grazed Varro's shoulder. Blood sprayed, bright against the sand, and the crowd roared. Varro was fast, his dagger weaving through Cassian's defenses, nicking his side. Pain flared, but Cassian pressed forward, his gladius a blur, driving Varro back. The Dacian stumbled, his shield dropping, and Cassian struck, his blade biting deep into Varro's chest. The secutor fell, his blood pooling, and the crowd surged to its feet, chanting, "Bear! Bear!" Cassian stood, his chest heaving, the rudis within reach. But as Varro's body was dragged away, a figure caught his eye. Mira, serving wine among the slaves, her face pale, her eyes locked on him. She gave a slight nod, a signal he didn't understand, but it stirred unease. Marcellus rose, his smile sharp, a fine show. "There," he said, holding up a wooden sword, its grain polished to a sheen. "One more fight, and it's yours." Cassian's jaw tightened. One more, always one more. A game Rome played to keep him chained. The second fight was brutal. A Thracian whose curved saka drew blood before Cassian felled him. The crowd's hunger grew, their cheers a fever. As Cassian returned to the cell, Mira slipped beside him, her voice a whisper. "They're moving tonight, Cassian. Livia's hidden the ledger, but Drusus is close. We need you." Cassian's heart sank. The network was acting, despite the betrayal, and his fight was their cover. "What's the cost?" he asked, his voice rough. Mira's eyes darkened. "A light, maybe more." Before he could press, she was gone, her tray of wine a shield. The final fight was against a Retiarius, a netman whose speed outmatched Cassian's strength. The net tangled his shield, the trident piercing his arm, but Cassian roared, breaking free and driving his gladius through the man's heart. The crowd erupted, Marcellus clapping, the rudis raised high. But as Cassian stepped forward, blood dripping from his wounds, Drusus appeared, his face a mask of triumph. "Take him," Drusus said, and guards seized Cassian, their grips iron. Marcellus's voice cut through the den. "You fought well, Bear, but your friends have been busy. Grain stolen, my stores bled dry. You're one of them, aren't you?" Cassian's blood ran cold. Felix's betrayal had reached further than he'd feared. And Mira's signal was a warning too late. He thought of Livia, Zoe, Titus, the network's heart, exposed. "I fight for you," Cassian lied, his voice steady. Netheric's heart, exposed. "I fight for you," Cassian lied, his voice steady. Marcellus laughed, tossing the rudis to the sand. "You fight for nothing. Take him to the mines. Let him die with the boy who found that cursed amulet." Cassian struggled, his wounds screaming, but the guards were too many. As they dragged him away, he saw Mira, her face stricken, slipping into the shadows. The rudis lay in the dust. Freedom a cruel jest. He had fought for the network, for a cause greater than himself, but the cost was his chance at life. Yet as the villa faded, Cassian's resolve hardened. He thought of Titus, of the amulet's mystery, of Livia's ledgers and Zoe's herbs. The mines were death, but he was the bear, and he would not break. Not yet. The kitchen's heat was a shroud, wrapping Zoe in a haze of steam and spice as she chopped leeks with a bronze knife, its edge dull from years of use. At 19, she was a ghost in Senator Gaius Marcellus's villa, her hands stained with garlic, her dark hair tied back with a rag. The air was thick with the scent of roasting boar and garum, the fish sauce that Rome's elite craved. But Zoe's mind was elsewhere. Her pouch of herbs, chamomile, mint, willow bark hung heavy beneath her tunic, a secret that had saved lives but now threatened her own. The network, A fragile web of slaves stealing grain and shielding the desperate was unraveling, and Zoe, its healer, stood on the edge of a reckoning. Felix's betrayal had cut deep. The kitchen boy's confession to Drusus exposing the Aventine shipment and endangering Livia's ledgers. Cassian, the gladiator called the Bear, had been taken, his chance at freedom crushed after a munus at the villa, his name now a whisper of warning. Zoe thought of Titus, the boy in Hispania's mines, whose amulet was a mystery tied to their cause. She thought of Livia, the scribe whose coded numbers had fed the Suburras starving, now hunted by the imperial auditor Lucius. The network was Zoe's family, bound by shared defiance, but Felix's weakness had turned their strength to ash. She stirred a pot of lentils, her hands trembling, the welts on her back from Drusus's whip a fading ache. Her herbs had drawn attention, first from Claudia, Marcellus's wife, whose daughter Flavia had recovered under Zoe's care, and now from whispers in the kitchen. Paulus, the head cook, had caught her slipping chamomile to a scullery maid, his eyes narrowing but his silence bought with a vial for his own pains. Yet silence was fleeting in a villa, where eyes and ears served Marcellus's will. Zoe's latest act, passing a vial to Mira for a runaway hidden in the Suburra, had been reckless, a spark in a house of tinder. The kitchen door swung open, admitting Drusus, his presence a blade in the heat. The slaves froze, their heads bowed, but Zoe felt his gaze like a brand. "Syrian," he said, his voice sharp. "With me." Her heart lurched, the knife slipping in her hand, nicking her finger. Blood welled, bright against the leek's green, but she wiped it on her tunic. Following Drusus into the corridor, the villa's frescoes, nymphs and gods, watched in silence, their colors vivid in the lamplight. Drusus's silence was heavier, his steps deliberate, leading her not to the atrium but to a small chamber, its door guarded by a burly freedman. Inside, Marcellus sat at a cedar table, his toga pristine, his face a mask of cold fury. Claudia stood beside him, her blue stola shimmering, her eyes fixed on Zoe with a mix of curiosity and disdain. Lucius, the imperial auditor, leaned against the wall, his thin frame deceptively relaxed, his gaze sharp as a quill. Zoe bowed, her throat tight, the pouch of herbs a burning weight. "You summoned me, Domine," she said, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her chest. Marcellus leaned forward, his fingers drumming the table. "Your herbs," he said, his tone deceptively calm. "They saved my daughter. But they've been busy elsewhere, haven't they?" Zoe's blood ran cold, but she kept her face blank, a skill honed in years of servitude. "I serve the household, Domine," she said. "My herbs are for those you command." Marcellus's eyes narrowed, and he gestured to Drusus, who produced a small vial. Zoe's work, chamomile and mint, the same she'd given Mira for the runaway. "This was found in the Suburra," Marcellus said, tossing the vial onto the table, where it rolled with a soft clink. "With a slave who shouldn't be alive. You know him, don't you?" Zoe's mind raced, her thoughts a tangle of lies and truths. The runaway, a stable hand who'd fled after a flogging, had been her patient, his wounds treated in secret. She'd thought him safe, hidden by the network, but Felix's betrayal had reached further than she'd feared. "I know nothing of runaways, Domine," she lied, her voice soft but firm. "I make remedies for the kitchen, for those who ask." Lucius stepped forward, his voice smooth as oil. "A fine story, but the Suburra talks. A Syrian healer, they say, whose herbs reach beyond these walls. And your gladiator friend, the bear, he's in the mines now, with a boy who found something curious. A bronze amulet. Celtic, they say. Zoe's heart pounded, her thoughts flashing to Cassian, to Titus, to the amulet Mira had called a key. Were they all exposed, their secrets laid bare? She thought of Livia, whose ledger was hidden behind the atrium's fountain, its code their last defense. Claudia spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. She saved Flavia, she said, her tone measured. She's useful. Gaius, punish her, but don't waste her. Marcellus's jaw tightened, his pride warring with practicality. He rose, towering over Zoe. You're a liar. Syrian, and liars bleed. Confess, and I'll spare your life. Name your accomplices, the scribe, the girl, the others. Zoe's breath caught, her mind racing. To confess was to doom Livia, Mira, the network entire. To resist was to invite death, or worse, the mines where Cassian now suffered. She thought of her mother, of Syrian nights when healing was a gift, not a crime. She thought of Felix, broken by fear, and Cassian, betrayed by hope. She thought of Titus, whose amulet might hold their salvation. I work alone, she said, her voice steady, a lie that burned her tongue. The vial was stolen. Domine, I know no scribe, no girl. Marcellus's hand lashed out, striking her cheek, the pain a white-hot spark. Zoe staggered but stood, her eyes locked on the floor, blood trickling from her lip. Drusus grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. The whip, Domine, he asked, eager. Marcellus waved a hand, his anger cooling to calculation. Not yet. She's Claudia's pet, for now. Lock her in the ergastulum tonight. Tomorrow, we'll see if she talks. The ergastulum, the villa's underground cell for errant slaves, was a pit of damp stone and despair. Zoe's heart sank, but she held her silence as Drusus dragged her away. The vial left on the table, a silent accusation. The ergastulum was cold, its walls slick with mold, the air heavy with the moans of other prisoners. Zoe sat on the straw-strewn floor, her cheek throbbing, her pouch still hidden, a small victory. She thought of Mira, who might yet warn Livia, and the network, wounded but alive. She thought of Cassian, in the mines with Titus, their fates entwined with her. As the door slammed shut, plunging her into darkness, Zoe whispered a prayer to her mother's gods, her resolve unbroken. She was a slave, a healer, a spark in Rome's vast machine. Tomorrow, she would face Marcellus, and she would not break, not yet. The Las Medulas mine was a wound in the earth, its tunnels a maze of shadow and stone where Titus, at 16, toiled under Rome's unyielding yoke. The air was thick with silica dust, coating his lungs as he swung his pickaxe, the clink of iron against rock a relentless pulse. His wiry frame, scarred from months underground, moved with a quiet strength, his eyes sharp despite the dim glow of his oil lamp. The bronze amulet, hidden beneath his ragged tunic, was a secret that burned brighter than any flame. A crescent-shaped relic, etched with Celtic symbols, found in a cavity of milky stone. It was more than a trinket, Cato had said, a key to something greater, tied to the network that bound Titus to others he'd never met. The mine was a graveyard, its shafts claiming lives with every tremor. But Titus had survived, his courage tested in a cave-in that left him bloodied but unbroken. He had saved 2 men, defying the overseer Vero's whip, and earned Cato's pride, the older slave his only family in this hell. But the network was faltering. Whispers from traitors spoke of betrayal in Rome. A boy, Felix, cracking under Drusus's lash, exposing the Aventine shipment. Livia, the scribe whose ledgers hid stolen grain, was hunted by an imperial auditor. Zoe, the Syrian healer whose herbs had reached the mines, was locked in Marcellus's ergastulum. And Cassian, the gladiator called the Bear, had been sent here, to Las Megillus, his freedom stolen after a munus that masked the network's moves. Titus struck the rock, his arms aching, his mind racing. Cassian's arrival had been a shock, his towering frame and green eyes unmistakable even in the mine's gloom. They'd met in the barracks, Cassian's voice rough but warm, his strength a spark in the dark. "You're Titus," he'd said, his gaze on the amulet Titus had dared to show him. "Mira spoke of you. That thing, it's Celtic, like my people." The revelation had stunned Titus. The amulet, a link to Cassian's Gaulish roots, was no mere charm but a symbol, perhaps a map, carried by slaves across Rome's empire. Cato, coughing and frail, had confirmed it. "It's a call, lad, a sign for those who fight." The network's plan, Mira's last message, was desperate. A final act to strike at Marcellus's wealth, to free Zoe and Livia, to spark a rebellion that would echo beyond Rome. The amulet was its heart, a signal to rally the Soberas desperate, the mines damned, the arena's survivors. But Vero's eyes were sharp, his whip quicker since Cassian's arrival, and the mine was a trap, its tunnels watched. Titus felt the amulet's weight, its edges sharp against his chest. He thought of Livia, her ledgers a code of defiance. Of Zoe, her herbs a gift of life. Of Cassian, his blade now broken but his will intact. They were his people, and he, a boy born in Rome's shadows, was their spark. A low rumble shook the shaft, dust raining down. Titus froze, his lamp flickering, his heart pounding. The mine was restless, its water-carved tunnels fragile. Cato, working beside him, coughed, his face gray. "Bad sign," he muttered, leaning on his pickaxe. Before Titus could reply, shouts echoed. Vero's voice, sharp with alarm. "Move, rats!" To the surface, the slaves scrambled, their lamps bobbing, but Titus hesitated, his eyes on Cassian, who stood at the shaft's edge, his expression grim. "It's now," Cassian whispered, his hand on Titus's shoulder. "The network's moving in Rome. We move here." Titus's breath caught. The plan was madness, a sabotage of the mine's water channels, flooding the shafts to halt production, to cripple Marcellus's gold for Trajan's wars. It would buy time for Livia and Zoe, a signal to the Subura that the network lived. But the cost was high. Flooded tunnels could trap them, and Varro's wrath would be merciless. Titus thought of the amulet, of Cato's words. A call. He nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'm with you," he said, his voice steady despite the fear. They moved quickly, slipping into a side shaft where the water channels ran, their lamps casting eerie light on the stone. Cassian's strength cleared debris, while Titus's small frame navigated the narrow pipes, loosening bolts with a stolen tool. The water roared, a beast waking, and Titus felt its power, a force to match Rome's might. Cato joined them, his coughs sharp, but his hands steady. Cough sap, but his hands steady. guiding them with a scribe's precision. For Alexandria, he murmured, a smile breaking through his pain. The first bolt gave, water spraying, and the shaft trembled. Titus worked faster, his hands raw, the amulet swinging free, its symbols glinting. Cassian's eyes met his. A silent vow, they would finish this, or die trying. For Varro's shout cut through, his lamp piercing the dark. Traitors, he roared, his whip cracking, guards at his heels. Titus froze, the water rising, cold against his legs. Cassian shoved him behind a rock, facing Varro, his fists clenched. Run, lad, he hissed. Get the amulet to Rome. Titus's heart tore, but he obeyed, crawling through the flooding shaft, the water a torrent now. Cato followed, his strength fading, his hand gripping Titus's arm. They reached the surface, the night air a shock, the stars cold above the mine's chaos. Guards swarmed, but the flood had sown panic, their shouts drowned by the water's roar. Titus clutched the amulet, its weight a promise. He thought of Livia, hiding her ledger, of Zoe, locked in the ergastulum, of Cassian, fighting below. The network's plan had worked, the mine was crippled. Marcellus's gold stalled, but the cost was heavy. Cato collapsed, his coughs wet, his eyes distant. Take it, lad, he gasped, pressing a scrap of cloth into Titus's hand, its stitches hiding a message. For Livia, for Zoe. Titus's throat tightened, tears mixing with dust. I will, he vowed, his voice breaking. Cato's smile was faint, his breath stilling as the stars watched. Titus stood, the cloth and amulet his burden, and ran, slipping past the guards into the hills. In Rome, the network stirred. Livia, freed by Mira's cunning, held the ledger, her code a beacon. Zoe, released when Claudia's mercy outweighed Marcellus's rage, brewed herbs for the Suburra's sick, her defiance unbroken. Cassian, bloodied but alive, was dragged from the mine, his sacrifice a spark for others. And Titus, a boy with an amulet, carried their fight forward, his steps guided by a call older than Rome. They were slaves, their lives hidden, but their defiance was a fire that would not die. Someone, they knew, would remember them, even in another time.